Whether you're looking for answers to specific life questions or simply hoping to become the best version of you possible, welcome to the Mental Breakdown and PsychReg podcast, where we offer insight, information, and strategies based upon research and years of practice as psychologists. So sit back, have a listen, and get connected with our hosts, Dr. Bernie Wilkinson and Dr. Richard Marshall. Whenever someone talks about bipolar disorder, they almost always refer to it as a chemical imbalance.
Right.
The truth is, I have no idea what that means.
Good. I mean, I'm glad you said that. Not good. I'm glad you said that.
Right, because
everybody talks about is it a chemical imbalance?
Right.
Probably.
I mean, but lots of things are chemical imbalances.
Right.
So when we think about what causes bipolar disorder, again, most people automatically go to this idea of a chemical imbalance. But there's far more to bipolar disorder than this.
Right. And we do the same thing with depression.
Right.
People talk about it's a chemical imbalance. What I think they're trying to say is that it may be a neurotransmitter.
Right.
Okay. And certainly that's one of the potential causes of depression, or which is unipolar depression, or bipolar depression.
Right.
Yeah, it might be a neurotransmitter, but it might be a number of other things.
Right. And I think that the problem with referring to it simply as a chemical imbalance is that we then assume, well, if it's a chemical imbalance, we should be able to measure those chemicals. We should be able to know exactly what chemicals are out of whack and fix that, and then we're done.
Well, we say it so knowledgeably,
right?
So with such certainty, this is a chemical. And you're right. As soon as you suggest that the problem is a chemical imbalance, the implication is we know what the chemical is,
right,
and we know how to fix it.
Yeah.
Neither of which is always true.
Right. Right. I mean, we have some ideas, and we're going to kind of talk about those a little bit today. But we need to shift this idea of it's just a chemical imbalance, and as though it's just as simple as that.
That is the answer.
Right.
Right. And we the fact is we don't know.
Right. Mm-hmm. So today we're going to talk about the things that kind of trigger, or the roots perhaps of some of the presentations of bipolar disorder, because it's like all things that we talk about here.
Right.
There are many different avenues that can lead to bipolar disorder.
That's right. And we don't the truth of the matter is we don't know a heck of a lot about the underlying brain mechanisms of any of these disorders. We talk with the similar certainty about ADHD, and yet we don't really know the pathophysiology of ADHD, and that's probably the most studied of all of these disorders is ADHD, and we still don't know the pathophysiology of that. People talk about dopamine. Well, there are at least 5 and maybe more dopamine pathways in the brain. Each does a different thing.
Right.
They sometimes work together and they sometimes work separately. So we're a long way from identifying with any certainty what causes these things. But we're going to bring you up to date.
Right. So as we try to do anytime we're talking about a particular condition, we want to kind of go through the biopsychosocial type of model and kind of, I keep saying kind of, but we want to present that information so that you're a little bit more informed. So the first piece that we're going to get to is the genetic piece, because there is, again, like with many of the other conditions we talk about, there seems to be some increased heritability to it.
And I think it's fair to say that in most of these disorders there is a heritability component.
Right. So yesterday we talked about the prevalence, and we said anywhere from 1 to 3% or so, depending on worldwide, right? Depending on where you are and things like that.
Right.
However, if you have a relative with bipolar disorder, your risk of having bipolar disorder increases by anywhere from 4 to 6 times.
That's right.
So if the regular prevalence is, say, 2%, if you have a family member with bipolar disorder, your risk automatically increases to anywhere from 8 to 12%.
That's right. Another way of putting it is that 2/3 of people with bipolar disorder have a relative with it. Most people with that bipolar disorder have a relative somewhere in the family tree. You may not know it, You may not be able to identify it. They may have gone undiagnosed, but it's a pretty significant percentage of people with bipolar disorder have a relative with the disorder.
Right. Now, very interestingly, there are some studies to suggest that if you have an identical twin with bipolar disorder, your risk of having bipolar disorder is 70%.
Right. That's right. It goes way up.
So the closer genetically you are to someone with bipolar disorder, people with who are identical twins are the closest that we can get to having the exact same genes. The closer you are to somebody genetically with bipolar disorder, the higher risk you have of having bipolar disorder yourself.
That's right. So if you have a parent, for example, when you go back to grandparents and aunts and uncles, the risk, the chances of you having bipolar disorder decline somewhat. But that's why it's important to do a thorough family history. Because if you have a relative, you're at increased risk.
Now, this holds some pretty important implications to some of the things we talked about yesterday. And that is, if you have a genetic predisposition for bipolar disorder, but you don't know that, or you're not really thinking about that, or the reality is most of us don't think about those kinds of things in everyday life. But then as an adolescent, say you present with depression. Now, that depression could be depression, major depressive disorder that we talked about last week, or it could be a depressive episode within what will eventually become bipolar disorder because you have that genetic predisposition. And we talked yesterday about the fact that many times people with bipolar disorder don't get diagnosed until much later because we have to wait for a manic episode to present and for somebody to identify it and recognize it as a manic episode and then make the diagnosis of bipolar disorder. This is where the importance of heritability comes into play, because if you have depression and you go see someone, especially if you're younger, teenage years, or in your 20s, or even in 30s for that matter, and you've never had a manic episode or anything before, but you've had recurring depressive episodes, when you see a mental health or medical professional, it's really important that you tell them that there's a family history of bipolar disorder so that they know for treatment purposes, which we're going to get to treatment later this week, but it's going to hold heavy implications when you get to treatment.
That's right. That's why it's tricky making these diagnoses in before somebody reaches adulthood, before about the age of 30 or 35, because changes could continue to occur. And so you have to be careful, and you have to keep close tabs on this thing, because in order to have bipolar 1, we'll talk about that in a minute, you have to have a manic episode. Well, you're right. You may not have a manic episode, your first manic episode, until you're 25 or 28 or 30. And so the diagnosis would change from depression to bipolar disorder.
Absolutely.
So be careful in rushing to judgment in teenage years.
So that's the genetic piece. That's the piece that you're sort of a piece that you're born with. Your genes are what they are, and there are those who say that the one, you may have a genetic predisposition for bipolar disorder, but it will only manifest if it's been triggered in some way, and we're going to talk about that.
And I think that's an important point to make, is that the problem with genetic risk, the problem of having these disorders in your family tree, is that it puts you at risk, and so you have to be very careful and very mindful of avoiding things that could trigger it. And one of the things we know is heavy drug use, for example, heavy alcohol use, excessive stress. All these things could be triggers that trigger those genes. The genes are there. They're waiting to be turned on. What you have to be careful of is that you don't do that. You avoid those things that are more likely to turn those genes on.
Structural. Now, shifting to the biological piece, there are some concerns as it relates to the structural and functional aspects of the brain in regards to bipolar disorder. There are some concerns about the and it seems, again, a recurring theme to talk about the hippocampus.
Right.
That's implicated, that there may be some brain cells that are damaged in the hippocampus in individuals with bipolar disorder. Again, it's not diagnostic. You can't do a test to look at that. But there is a increased risk, increased likelihood of a person with bipolar disorder to have some damage to some of the cells in the hippocampus.
Right. Yeah, there have been 3 areas of the brain that have been, now we have some documentation. One is the hippocampus.
Right.
And as I was reading this about the hippocampus, because the hippocampus, they associate the hippocampal function with impulse control and inhibition, mainly impulses. And I thought of rabies, because the rabies virus destroys the hippocampus. So a dog or an animal with rabies has little impulse control.
Right.
Okay, when you say a rabid dog, it's a dog that's very aggressive and has few impulses. And so the same thing, but to a lesser extent, may be happening with bipolar disorders. You have people with less impulse control because the hippocampus has been damaged somewhat. We don't know what that damage looks like, but so the hippocampus has been implicated. The other area that's been implicated is the prefrontal cortex, both the middle of the middle and underside of the frontal lobes have been implicated, and that's where inhibition is. And so people with bipolar disorder have less reduced function in the prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex provides inhibition. And curiously, the third area is the cerebellum, which is just coming out in the news. There's some research being done. I think it's being done in Australia, which has implicated the cerebellum in some of these things, quite by accident. I guess it was a graduate student who was doing research. And they said, well, let's take a look at the hippocampus, and sure enough, there was I guess some white matter reduction
in the cerebellum.
In the cerebellum, which is a new finding. It's just an emerging literature, an emerging body of research.
I think we're going to find more and more about the cerebellum because, in my training, and I would assume with yours too, the cerebellum has been largely ignored. It's sort of been implicated with balance and some motor function and stuff like that. But I think that it's going to.
I always taught what we were taught, and what we taught our students was that when you think about the cerebellum, think of a person playing the banjo or a piano very quickly, and it's those rapid movements that you can't do consciously that your cerebellum sort of takes over, and then balance and coordination. But now we know it's been implicated in reading. It's been now it's being implicated in bipolar disorder. I mean, everything we retain serves a function. It's like your appendix, Okay, go ahead and take them. Or like tonsils and adenoids. Then you're at later risk for respiratory problems when you're, because you have them removed. So everything's there for a reason. So the cerebellum, which means little brain, is there for a reason, and we're just discovering what some of those are.
It's a little cauliflower-looking thing in the back underneath your.
It's like every time I make cauliflower, I think of the cerebellum.
Which makes us big nerds.
Big nerds. That's right. If we're doing that, so those are 3 areas of the brain that have been implicated. Now, the interesting issue is. And this is a fascinating area of research. Is it that people with those brain differences have bipolar disorder, or is there something about bipolar disorder, some active process? Because lithium, which is one of the treatments, I don't know quite what it does, but lithium seems to change these things and even improve some of these things. We talk about the white matter of the cerebellum seems to grow a little bit in people who take lithium, which was also a surprise. Why should lithium do that? So that's going to be another area of research that we have to keep an eye on.
Absolutely. So another thing in the biological realm has to do with neurotransmitters. And when we think of mood, there are
that's where we started.
Right.
Was that chemical imbalance?
That's right.
Yeah.
We have. Historically, we've attributed mood-related disorders to serotonin. And this was the accidental finding back in the 50s with depression, right? And so we have this whole line of serotonin-related medications that have been developed as a result of this accidental finding with depression. Right. And so when it comes to bipolar disorder, maybe there's some relationship because we do have these depressive episodes, and so serotonin must be implicated in some way. More recently, we're looking at the research has been looking at two particular neurotransmitters, serotonin, but also norepinephrine. And what the newest research is sort of starting to suggest is that when we have a person with depression, that person has low serotonin and low norepinephrine. They're both low. That's why you have low energy and things like that, because norepinephrine is related to energy levels and activation and things like that. With bipolar disorder, however, you have low serotonin, but you have high norepinephrine.
Right.
And so that is what makes you sort of have some of those depressive-like mood-related down symptoms, but also lots of energy and that high activation with serotonin or norepinephrine. And so we have to be careful. Again, we're going to talk about this on Saturday with our treatment podcast. Some of the concerns as it relates to medications used in bipolar disorder, because if you significantly increase serotonin and or norepinephrine in a person with bipolar disorder, you're really setting them up for danger.
That's right. And, we have this black box warning on these medications. You hear about that, or you hear news stories about medications cause suicide. It's not that the medications cause suicide. It's that an antidepressant, and this is a very important part of treatment, an antidepressant, like a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, handles the depression, but it allows the manic episode, the manic phase. It triggers the manic phase and makes it worse.
Right, absolutely.
So that's why diagnosis is so important. We talked about it earlier. Make sure you do that family history because bipolar disorder could be lurking.
Right, absolutely. So the last piece of the biological aspect is really some newer research, and that has to do with, we're really narrowing in and getting into the cell itself. And I always say Mr. Mitochondria.
Mr. Mitochondria.
You see those videos when you're entering? Mr. Mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell.
This is so, this always worries me when we start. I always get I get very tentative when I enter the body of a cell because it's so incredibly complicated.
Right.
The mitochondria is simply one of those structures inside a cell that we're learning a little bit more about. And so here too it's been implicated.
Yeah, it looks like a little bean.
It's a complicated
mess.
But
it really creates the energy for the cell.
That's really the furnace, the energy source of the cells, the mitochondria.
Yeah.
But it's a contained structure inside the cell.
So it's amazing.
I'm reading.
Okay, we're nerding out way too much today.
Okay.
I want to read more.
I'll contain myself.
I know, right?
Okay. So there's a few others.
Yes. So now we're finally getting to some of the social, environmental contributing factors to bipolar disorder. And this is related to, as you said earlier, if you have that genetic predisposition, there are things that can happen in the environment that will trigger the expression of those genes. High stress, abuse, substance abuse, all those kinds of things can trigger the expression of those genes, and create the perfect scenario for the development of bipolar disorder.
We have this phrase, the body knows.
Right.
And if you're under extreme stress, whether it's military or family or it doesn't matter, divorce, and you put your body under that extreme stress, the body's going to respond, and it's going to pick on those things that are in your family tree.
Right.
I mean, if you have a family history of digestive problems, ulcers and ulcerative colitis and IBS and all those things, you're probably going to move in that direction. If you have a history of migraines, you might move in that direction. If you have a history of bipolar disorder, these environmental stressors are going to likely move you in that direction.
Absolutely.
It'll seek out the weak link
right.
and find it and exploit it.
So that's the main issue socially and environmentally as it relates to the cause of bipolar disorder. But they're also related to the ongoing expression of bipolar disorder. So when we talk about treatment, the psychological treatment of bipolar disorder really focuses on these things. You have to maintain healthy sleep habits. You have to manage your stress. You have to control these things as best you can, because that's going to decrease the risk of ongoing manic and depressive episodes.
You have to deal with the risk, these factors that trigger the genetic expression of these different disorders. And you know, you can't maintain the same lifestyle that triggered the disorder and just put some medication on it. You know, that's not going to handle the problem.
Right. Some other factors that contribute: age.
Of course.
You know, bipolar disorder tends. To me, there's these these ages that you want to keep track of over the course of your life. You know, if you can make it to 3 and you're communicating and you're social and those things, you can rule out most of like the autistic spectrum disorders and things like that. If you can make it to 8 or so and you're reading and you're paying attention in class, you can rule out learning disabilities and ADHD. If you can make it to 25 to 30 and you don't have you don't have hallucinations, you can rule out schizophrenia. If you don't have, you know, some of these,
you don't have a psychotic disorder. If you get to 25 and the calendar's still pretty clean. You're
doing okay.
If you get to 30.
If you get to 30, then you can start ruling out bipolar disorder and some of those things.
A mood disorder.
And interestingly, if you get to 70, 75,
if you get to 50,
and you're not, and
get AARP.
But if you get to 70 or 75 and you don't have any significant memory-related issues, you can start ruling out like Alzheimer's and things like that, because that's
age-related dementias.
So there's these things, but so with bipolar disorder, you're looking at 25 to 30 or so. If you can, if it's usually going to manifest around that time. And that should make sense, because it's usually around that time in the early 20s or so that you're going through some significant life changes, where you're getting out of school, you're entering the work force. If you're in the military, you know, you're in active military at that time. You're involved in serious relationships and things like that. And so that time frame is really critical as it relates to some of those environmental triggers.
And the brain has stopped developing. Around your mid-20s, the frontal lobes have completely myelinated, and so now that process of blossoming and pruning is now over, and you have this, what we refer to as the adult brain. And so it's going to express. So age is one thing.
Gender. Bipolar disorder type 1, we'll talk about that tomorrow's podcast, is about equally prevalent in men and women. Bipolar disorder type 2 is more prevalent in women than in men. We also have some hormonal concerns. There seems to be some things with like the thyroid, which we've talked about before, some of those types of medical concerns that could trigger.
In both men and women. We tend to think of hormonal problems mainly in women, but men and women can have hormonal problems. So there's a number of things that we have to monitor and evaluate when we're talking about bipolar disorder. So it's not just a chemical imbalance. Hence the title.
Exactly.
What chemical imbalance? Because there are many other issues here. I think the important message in this one is family history. I mean, if you have a family history, you have to be careful, and you have to take care of yourself. Eat, exercise, and sleep.
Absolutely. So, all right. Well, that is it then for today. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, don't forget to be afraid. Thanks for sharing this episode of the Mental Breakdown and PsychReg podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to follow us on Twitter and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you will find all of our previous podcasts and much more. We would be honored if you would become a patron through patreon.com, where any donation you can manage will go to the development and creation of more content. Just visit patreon.com/thementalbreakdown for more information. Thanks again for listening. Have an awesome day, and we look forward to being back in your feed tomorrow morning.